The dinner that changed everything. I'm about to tell you a story that still sends chills down my spine every single time I think about it. It's about one ordinary evening that became the most terrifying night of my life. You ever get that feeling that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, but you can't quite explain why? That's exactly what happened to me when I was just 15 years old at an isolated farmhouse in rural Vermont. It was late fall of 2018 when we received an invitation from the Ashford family to a special dinner at their property. You know the type. Families that everyone in a small town respects, but nobody can quite explain why. That was them. The farm sat about 25 miles outside town, surrounded by dense forest and absolute silence. When we arrived, darkness was already falling. The massive colonial house rose against the twilight, like something from another era, another time. My parents, my older sister Eleanor, and I were greeted by Mr. Henry, a man in his 60s with piercing, unsettling eyes, his wife Margaret, and their son Thomas, who was roughly my age. The house was extraordinary, but the atmosphere was suffocating. That feeling you get when you walk into a place and every instinct screams at you to leave. That's what I felt. The walls were covered in old paintings, family portraits, dark landscapes, and one in particular that caught my attention. A Native American warrior holding a spear, his eyes seeming to track my movement throughout the room. The dining table was an enormous piece of solid wood that dominated the main hall. Margaret had prepared a feast fit for royalty, but I could barely focus on the food. Something was profoundly wrong here. Eleanor kept fidgeting nervously with her napkin, her hands trembling slightly. She felt it, too. It was almost 9 o'clock when it began. My father was telling an amusing story from work. Everyone was laughing when I noticed my mother had gone completely still. Her fork hung frozen in midair, her face drained of all color as she stared down at her plate, as if seeing something revolting, something impossible. "Mom, are you okay?" I whispered. She slowly raised her head and looked at me. I swear on everything, what I saw in those eyes was not my mother. It was pure, primal rage. Something feral and ancient had taken control of her body. What happened next still visits me in nightmares. My mother began making sounds I'd never heard a human voice produce. Not cries of pain. Rosnars, deep guttural animal sounds that started low but grew increasingly louder and more threatening. Everyone at the table froze. The silence became so dense, so overwhelming, that all we could hear were those bestial growls pouring from my mother's throat. Then she stood up. The movement was wrong, completely inhuman. You know that moment when you watch a predator prepare to strike? That's what I witnessed. Her hands curled into what looked like claws, and she began sniffing the air as though hunting prey. And then I saw it. I don't know if it was terror, shock, or something actually happening before my eyes, but for several seconds, and I swear this is true, where my mother stood was something else entirely, a massive reptilian creature. Its skin was covered in dark scales that seemed to shimmer under the light. Its eyes burned with a sickly red radiance, and across its back there seemed to be something like invisible chains, restraining it, barely holding it in place. The creature, because it was no longer my mother, began moving across the floor on all fours, fast, silent, directed toward the darkest corner of the room where potted plants clustered beneath the staircase. Eleanor, who'd always been braver than me, ran after her. Somehow, I still don't understand how, she managed to communicate with whatever that thing was. For nearly half an hour, my sister spoke to it, reasoned with it, until finally it retreated, and my mother slowly returned to herself. When everything ended, Margaret was visibly shaken. That's when she confessed the truth. This dining room wasn't just for family meals. For years, she and her late husband had conducted rituals in this space, rituals that had left the house inhabited by entities she no longer had any control over. According to her, there were spirits trapped within these walls for decades, waiting for an opportunity to manifest through someone with spiritual sensitivity. Someone like my mother. We left that house that same night and never returned. The Ashford family relocated out of the state within months. No one ever heard from them again. My mother spent weeks recovering from what had happened. She said she remembered everything, but as an observer, watching herself, feeling everything, yet unable to control any of her actions. The most disturbing part, she confirmed that she had seen the world through that creature's eyes, and for those terrifying moments, she felt an overwhelming, uncontrollable urge to hurt all of us, to unleash something ancient and hungry that had been imprisoned for far too long. This experience taught me that people are not always what they seem, and that there are places in this world where you should never set foot, no matter how welcoming they appear, no matter how safe the invitation seems. If you ever feel that sensation, that wrongness, that instinct screaming at you to run, listen to it, because sometimes our minds recognize dangers that our eyes cannot yet see. Some things are better left unexplained. If this story sent a chill through you, leave a like and share it with someone who dares to explore the darkness. Subscribe to Echoes in the Dark for more true accounts of the inexplicable and the forbidden. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew? I want to hear your stories. They might be featured in our next episode. Stay safe out there and trust your instincts.